Chapter 9. After many weeks, the boy that looked back at Georgie from his mirror was as changed as the rest of his life had changed. His arm was healed and well again, the heavy cast thrown away. The bruises and discolorations had faded, and his cheeks had taken on the rosiness of Timothy's, but without Timothy's freckles. His thick brown hair was shining after the regular shampoos that Sister Monica insisted that he take, and it had been allowed to grow until it covered the crumpled ear and a part of the white streak extending down his neck. "I think we have a fine-looking young man here, sister," the barber, who came out once a month to the school, turned Georgie's head this way and that, swirling some of the brown curls across his forehead, snipping a bit more above the collar. Sister Dolores, who was supervising the haircuts that turned Georgie around to inspect him. "A new haircut and studying with Mr. Collier have made a new boy out of this one," she told the barber. Then she gave Georgie a light smack and told him to run along to his lessons. He and the grandfather had worked together during the weeks of early spring and summer. At first, Mr. Collier came over to the school and read many books to Georgie in his room. Later, he took his pupil down to the banyan tree playhouse, and there they wrote stories together, which Georgie read aloud, and then listened happily as the grandfather praised him. One day, they taped Georgie's reading on the little recorder Mr. Collier brought over to the school. Georgie was fascinated by the sound of his own voice reading through a long paragraph that would have been a puzzle to him a few months earlier. They continued the taping from time to time, and as the days passed, Mr. Collier would replay the first tapes, allowing Georgie to hear and estimate his progress. By midsummer, Georgie was able to read simple stories, and he was happy to read aloud to anyone who would listen. He read to his rosebush, to Mr. Collier, to some of the nuns who were his special friends. All of them, even the rosebush, told him that he was reading so well that they felt very proud of him. Sometimes Sister Mary Angela would invite him to come into her office and read to her while she leaned far back in the swivel chair in front of her desk and closed her eyes so that she could listen better. Then, when he was finished with his story, they would often talk together about other stories he had read, about baseball and arithmetic and caring for flowers, especially roses. "Do you like living here at this school, Georgie?" she asked him one day. She asked the question so suddenly that he was surprised. He had just lived there and learned his way around, and things were nice, but he hadn't thought about liking to live there. Then, when he thought about Sister's question, he realized that, yes, he liked it very much. He liked learning to read and feeling safe at night and having friends like Timothy and little Robin. He nodded to Sister Mary Angela. "Yes, ma'am, I like it here," he told her. "Then I guess you want to stay, don't you?" she asked. Georgie was puzzled. "Do you mean maybe I can't stay?" he asked. Sister Mary Angela smiled at him. "No, I don't mean that. You can stay, and I'm happy about that. We were troubled for a while about finding the money it takes to keep you here, but now everything is settled." "Does it cost a lot to be here?" He was worried. Sister Mary Angela leaned over and took his hand. "Yes, a place like this costs a good deal of money, Georgie, but someone came in yesterday and gave me a check that will pay all of your expenses for a year. Do you know who it was?" He shook his head, and she smiled at the relief in his face. "It was Mrs. Harper," she said quietly. He looked down at the floor without speaking. "Can you forgive her now, Georgie?" After a long time, he muttered, "I hate people that hurt my bush." "But she changed her mind, Georgie. She allowed you to put your bush in her garden." He shook his head. "Robin's grandfather and you made her do it. She don't dare be mean to it while you're watching." Sister Mary Angela sat unmoving for a while. When she spoke, her voice was very firm. "When I lived in the north a few years ago, Georgie, my car used to get stuck in ruts on the country roads I had to travel. The ruts were deep and packed with snow that melted and turned into ice. You should have seen the tires spin in those icy ruts when I tried to get my car out on level ground again. They'd whirl round and round, getting absolutely nowhere except maybe a little deeper in the ice. She paused and looked directly into his eyes. "That's the way your anger towards Mrs. Harper behaves, Georgie. It spins round and gets nowhere, just deeper and more hurtful to all of us who want to see you out on level ground." He waited a long time before he replied. Then he said quietly, "I can't help it, sister." She just looked at him. "Then we'll have to wait until the ice melts." She seemed to be talking to herself. Georgie was able to look above or beyond, sometimes it seemed even through Molly Harper, without so much as blinking or changing his expression. With Robin, however, his tenderness was as warm as his dislike for Robin's mother was icy. Timothy noticed all this and took his friend to task. "I know she was mean about the rose bush, but after all, you had smashed her calla lilies. If she was nice enough to let old Eddie plant your bush over there, I think you might unbend her way a little." After that speech, Timothy was avoided for days while Georgie gave all his attention to Robin and the rose bush. Robin would go with his grandfather down to the banyan tree playhouse and sit, protesting and wiggling, while Mr. Collier read aloud to Georgie, waiting for the minute the book was closed and signs were made that the lesson was ended. Then he would run to Georgie's side, babbling excitedly, pulling and tugging at his arms to gain attention. They would romp together then, rolling in the grass, digging in the white sand along the lake shore, filling pails with shells and pebbles. They stopped at the kitchen almost every day when Georgie was through with his lessons and chores over at the school, to ask Rosita for bread to feed the hungry ducks. At first, Rosita was wary of their trips to the lake. "Have you asked Robin's grandfather if it's all right?" she would ask. "I always do," he would answer. "Do you know what would happen to our boy if you didn't keep an eye on him every minute?" "Yes, ma'am." To himself he said, "What does she think? Does she think I'm not smart enough to take good care of Robin?" For the first several times, Mr. Collier went with Georgie when he took Robin down to the lake. Sometimes he stood a short distance from them and watched as they romped in the sand. Occasionally, when they went down alone, he would step out from a clump of trees, pretending that he had just happened along. Georgie understood well enough. Mr. Collier was watching him carefully, making sure that Georgie was not the kind of kid who would ever neglect Robin. Georgie liked having Mr. Collier stop sometimes to hear a few new words Robin had learned to say. "Tell grandfather who you are, Robin," he would say. Often it would take lots of urging before Robin would answer. Then finally he would say, "Robin, big boy," and Georgie would smile proudly as he looked up at Mr. Collier. He thought surely that Mr. Collier would be glad when he heard Robin say a few new words. But there was this strange, sad look in the grandfather's eyes as he picked Robin up in his arms. "Yes, Robin, you are a big boy," he said, but his voice sounded tired as he spoke. After a while, Mr. Collier turned to Georgie. "You are trying hard to help him, Georgie. Paul used to try too. He was very patient with his little brother." Georgie had wondered about Robin's brother sometimes as he sat in the banyan tree playhouse. This had been Paul's special place, the hideaway, Georgie had been told, where the Harper boy had come to read or to play at make-believe. Georgie wondered if Paul would have wanted a strange boy to be in his playhouse, a boy who until recently had not been able to read, who still had shameful welts on his back, a boy who hated Paul's mother. There was nothing that pleased Robin so much as feeding the ducks. He grew wildly excited as he watched them approach the shore, eager for their treat, and he squatted and rose repeatedly, making an awkward attempt at jumping up and down. Georgie kept a firm grip on the child's shirt as Robin walked a little way out into the water, screaming partly in delight, partly in fear as one of the ducks snatched at a piece of bread Georgie held out to them. Georgie had to wait until every duck had given up hope of anything more to eat and had paddled away before Robin was willing to leave the lake shore. Robin walked more steadily than he had the year before. Mr. Collier mentioned that, but he still held tight to Georgie's hand, looking back at the ducks occasionally and babbling happily as he and Georgie approached the banyan tree. Slowly, Georgie began to understand Robin's incoherent attempts at talking that so often puzzled his grandfather. "Do you understand him, Georgie? What is he trying to tell us?" Mr. Collier would often ask, and more often Georgie was able to interpret. "He wants me to build a house for the birds," Georgie reported one day. He shook his head, frowning. "I'm not very good at building things," he said. "I don't think I know how to build a birdhouse." "It isn't the house that is important, Georgie. It's the work of building it," Mr. Collier said, and that proved to be true. Robin didn't care that a birdhouse failed to grow out of the scraps of wood old Eddie found for them. It was enough that he learned, with Georgie's help, to hit a nail so that it would stand, however unsteadily, in one of the pieces of soft wood. The fun of pounding nail after nail while Georgie stood at his side was enough to bring contentment to Robin's world. More and more often he looked to Georgie for comfort when a finger was hurt or a knee skinned, or when he was frightened by a sudden thunderbolt. He began to stand at the south side of the garden every afternoon watching for Georgie to appear when the boys came running out of school after classes were over. For Georgie, it was a wonderful thing to know that Robin loved him. He would have gladly spent all of his free hours at Robin's side. But Mr. Collier, watching them play together for hours each day, shook his head. "We can't allow Robin to demand all of your time and attention, Georgie. He loves you, and I'm happy about that, but you must be with boys your own age more often. We hire Amanda to take care of Robin. She can help him feed the ducks and pound nails. You must do things with your friends." And so, little by little, Georgie began spending more time at school. Because he was alert and quick, he became a regular on the baseball team made up of the younger boys in school. He enjoyed swimming, too, learning quickly with Sister Monica's help. It was in the swimming pool, though, that his first fight in this new school had its beginning. The boys stripped to their waists when they went to the pool. They beat their chests with Tarzan yells and felt the hot sun baking their backs browner and browner each day. Sister Monica had never said they must strip to the waist, only that it was all right if they wanted to. Georgie asked if he could wear his shirt, and she said okay. One day, however, when she was busy at the other end of the pool, Richie Barnes took it upon himself to see that Georgie stripped as the others did. "Take that shirt off when you come in this pool, fellow," he roared, throwing handfuls of water up at Georgie's face. "I won't do it," Georgie answered. "It's none of your business about my shirt." Richie knew how to make his eyes narrow. It gave him a fierce look that worked sometimes with the 7-year-olds when he tried to bully them. "You take that shirt off, you Tampa bum, or I'll take it off for you," he bellowed, approaching Georgie, who stepped out of the pool and waited for Richie, his fists clenched. It wasn't a long fight, but it was a rough one, which lasted only until Sister Monica grasped a handful of wet hair on either head and led the combatants inside the gym. When they dried off enough to prevent dripping, she escorted them to Sister Mary Angela's office. It was the first time Georgie had been led into the office for a scolding. He wouldn't look at Sister Mary Angela. She was neither angry nor bothered, just cool. "I see you've given Richie a black eye, Georgie. It's rather dangerous and painful to get a black eye, isn't it?" Georgie knew that she was asking him to remember the many times his own eyes had been dangerously and painfully blackened. He nodded without raising his eyes. She turned then to Richie. "And people who insist upon butting into other people's business can expect to be roughed up a little, eh, Richie?" "It was such a dumb thing to get mad about," Richie spluttered. "Sister Monica always tells us we can take off our shirts before we go in the pool. Why does Georgie have to think he's different?" "Sister Monica tells me that you're a very good swimmer, Richie," she remarked without answering his question. Richie glowed, black eye and all. "Yes, I am," he acknowledged. "I'm the best in our class. If I were a young man who may be swimming in the Olympics someday, I think I'd give my attention to practice rather than trying to boss someone else around about whether or not he wears a shirt while he's in swimming." She leaned her elbows on the desk and regarded the boys frostily. "So, attend to your own business, Mr. Barnes, And you may wear your shirt in the pool, Mr. Burgess. Just be careful about using those fists too freely from now on." With that, she dismissed them, but Sister Monica made them both get dressed and go to their rooms until lunchtime. That afternoon, Timothy and Georgie took a long walk through the woods and finally around to the lake shore. Timothy was thoughtful and sober. "I know Richie is a stinker, Georgie. All of us think he is when he gets into a mean groove. But I don't understand. Why did you get so mad about that shirt deal?" "I don't want to talk about it," Georgie answered and walked on with his head lowered. "I don't blame you for blacking his eye, but I've been wondering about it too. Why do you always wear a shirt in the pool when none of the rest of us do?" "That's none of your business, Tim." Georgie felt sorry to be talking to Timothy like that, but he had to stop the questioning if he could. They had reached the banyan tree and seated themselves for a rest in Paul's playhouse. "I thought me and you was friends, Georgie," Timothy remarked. "We are," Georgie answered. "Well, look, if I'm your friend, why can't you tell me why wearing a shirt in the pool is so gosh awful important to you?" Georgie looked straight into Timothy's eyes for a long time. Then he slowly made up his mind about something that had never quite lost its terror for him. To Timothy he said, "You won't never tell?" "No, of course not." Georgie drew a long breath. "All right then, I'll show you because you're my friend. But if you ever tell anyone, I'll hate you and I'll never be your friend again." As he spoke, he slowly unbuttoned his shirt and, throwing it aside, allowed Timothy to see his mutilated back. Timothy gasped. "What happened to you, Georgie? What made your back like that?" Georgie swallowed hard before he spoke. "There was a man in Tampa," he said finally, "and he hated me. I was afraid of him and he knowed it. So he liked to hurt me. Every time he come to the apartment, he took off his belt and whipped me. Sometimes he used a stick. You asked me once how I got my arm hurt. Steve broke it with the leg of a chair he smashed." Georgie's heart beat fast. At last he had done it. He had defied his mother's warnings and had dared an invisible Steve to leap out from some hiding place and kill him on the spot. A wave of fear ran through him in spite of the fact that he knew here at school he was safely hidden from Steve, that there were people around to protect him even if Steve should suddenly appear. After a minute, though, he felt stronger. He looked up calmly into Timothy's stricken face. "Didn't your dad and Mom call the police, Georgie? Didn't your dad hit the man?" Timothy asked. "I don't have any dad that I know about. And my mother liked Steve. Sometimes she helped him tie me up in the closet." "Oh, no. Oh, no." Timothy could think of nothing more to say. His own mother loved him a lot, sometimes more than he wanted to be loved when other people were around. His father was dead, but Timothy was able to remember a big man who played games with him, who never failed to bring home a present when he'd been away for a few days. He stared at Georgie. "I didn't know there was people that mean in all the world," he muttered. "There is, though. Except maybe now Steve's dead. I hope he is." "I hope so, too." They were silent then as Georgie drew on his shirt again. "But it wasn't your fault, Georgie," Timothy said after a while. "Why couldn't you let the other guys know how it happened? They'd feel as mad about it as I do." "I guess I'm ashamed." He finished buttoning his shirt and added brusquely, "I still don't like to talk about it, Tim." They started up the sloping path that led to the Harpers' big white house and to the garden no longer forbidden to Georgie or to an occasional friend of his. They didn't say anything at first. Then, seeing Robin watching them at the gate, they broke into a run to see who could reach him first. Inside the yard, they made a saddle with their clasped hands and gave the delighted little boy a ride around the garden, stopping to admire Georgie's rose bush and to count the red blooms upon it. All of them laughed noisily and yelled at times, but in a secret part of Georgie's mind, everything was quiet and peaceful, like the garden was in the early part of night. He was glad that Timothy knew about his back. He was sure that Timothy would never mention it again.